Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. One day the land became flat again, and on either side of the wagon, green fields dotted with cotton plants appeared. Up and down the rows, lines of slaves chopped the rich, black soil with their long-handled hoes. "Looks like we've made it to Ole Mississippi," the fat man called out to the driver, who jolted about on the wagon seat. "Won't be long now." This was one of the few sentences the driver had spoken on the long trip. Julilly felt both relief and uneasiness. This must be the dreaded Deep South that Massa Henson's slaves had all talked about. But it did mean that the wagon would finally stop. Might it even be that Mammy Sally was here? At a jog in the road, the wagon turned into a lane that seemed to lead straight into a field. The driver and the fat man appeared tense and nervous. They smoothed their hair and tidied their rumpled shirts and stained trousers as best they could. Then the wagon stopped bumping as the road became smooth and hard. Instead of brambles and shaggy bushes on either side, there were rows and rows of tall, wrinkle-barked oak trees. Julilly's eyes widened, for hanging from the branches and floating back and forth in the summer breeze were silent cloud-like drapes of swaying gray moss. It was cool and soft and beautiful, and Julilly wanted to catch it in her arms. But the row of trees ended in a stretch of thick green grass. Shading it from every ray of sun were 3 wide-spreading magnolia trees. Fresh, white blossoms sprang from the heavy waxed leaves. To Julilly, they looked like the white linen napkins from Missy Henson's big house hanging up to dry. A gentle fragrance filled the air. Then, Julilly saw the big house. She stared. It was not at all like Massa Henson's. Clean, white pillars rose in front of the largest house she had ever seen. They looked as though they sprouted from the earth. And between them, in glistening white, were rows of steps fanned out like a peacock's plume. 2 white folks sat on the green lawn in wide-frame chairs. The man was tall and thin. Julilly especially noticed that his hair was copper red and that his sharp, trimmed beard matched it exactly. His knees were crossed, and his high riding boots shone like pools of muddy water. He flicked a riding whip and laughed at a row of white geese parading over the lawn. The woman was frail and sank back in her chair into the fluffy billows of a pink dress. Neither of them looked in the direction of Julilly's wagon. They barely noticed the fat man who walked toward them until he said, "Mornin', sir." The fat man bowed slightly and waited. "I see, Sims," drawled the man in the chair. "You've bought us a sorry-lookin' parcel of slaves." He glanced briefly at the chained Adam, Ben, and Lester. "Get them back to the nigger quarters and see that they're ready for work in the mornin'." "Yes, sir." Sims bowed again. "Good day to y'all, Miss Riley, Master Riley." The fat man backed away toward the slave wagon. So, Julilly thought to herself, this is the Riley plantation, and he's the Massa same as Massa Henson. Then, with a shock, she realized that the fat man, Sims, was the overseer. He was boss of all the slaves. The wagon pulled back to a thin road behind the big house. Weeds and tangled brambles took over between the trees. There was a wide space at the end of the road, but no grass grew on it. The stomping bare feet of hundreds of black folks had packed the earth into a hard, bare floor. It must be Sunday, Julilly decided, for all the slaves were at home. She wondered if Sunday here would be the same as at Massa Henson's, where a banjo would be scrounged up and washing, cooking, and visiting were done. And maybe, as at Massa Henson's, a banjo would be scrounged up and dancing and singing would start. The little children in the cart leaned eagerly over the sides, perhaps expecting to find home and their mammies. But Julilly drew back into a corner. This wasn't like Massa Henson's slave quarters. There was no laughter and almost no talk. The old folks leaned idle against the doors of 2 long rows of tattered huts. The children, with legs scrawny as chicken legs, sat scratching in the dust with sticks and feathers. They had caved-in cheeks that sucked the smiles off their tiny faces. At Massa Henson's, there had been gardens around the huts and a hen scratching here and there. But here the huts were low and ugly. The doors sagged on broken hinges, and the walls of logs spread wide where the mud chinking had fallen out. There was fear and a set, unspoken hatred in the eyes of the slaves when fat, red-faced Sims strode near them. He stopped between the cabin rows and ran the pudginess of his hand over his oily wet hair. His jaybird voice screeched. Some of you lazy niggers take these boys to the tool house and unloose their chains. See that they're ready for work in the morning. He kicked his heavy foot in the direction of Adam, Ben, and Lester. Julilly's wagon stopped before a low building. It was longer than the other huts. Take these babies, Granny, he sneered at a sullen old woman, dried up like a crinkly brown leaf. She sucked at an empty pipe. A younger woman came forward and carried them one by one into the low house. They whimpered and reached after Julilly, but the woman closed their mouths with her wide, black hand and hurried them through the sagging door. Julilly began climbing off the wagon to follow them. They were almost like her babies now. Little Willie Brown broke loose from the wrinkled old granny and grabbed Julilly's skirt. "Julilly!" he screamed. Sim scowled at the two of them with sudden anger. "Shut that baby's mouth, Granny," he shouted at the old lady. She grabbed Willie with one claw-like hand and shut his mouth with the other. Sim's small eyes appraised Julilly. "She's big for her age and strong. Put her with the field niggers that ain't got families." He stretched his whip in the direction of another long cabin. Julilly walked away from the children toward an ugly, long shack and went inside. There was light and air only from the open door and the cracks in the wall. The small space of hard dirt floor seemed packed with girls, each one clinging to a pile of filthy rags. Julilly didn't look for Mammy Sally. She didn't want to find her here. There was an empty space beside a sullen, hunchbacked girl. Even in the dim light, Julilly could see ugly scars running down her legs and across her cheeks. "I'm Liza," a soft voice spoke from the deep shadow against the wall. Julilly sat down beside her. Chapter 6. Liza was the only one in the long room of slave girls who offered Julilly any kind of welcome. There was a listlessness about the others that was like sickness. Liza reached up and touched Julilly's hand. She pulled her down beside her. "You been snatched from your mammy?" she asked. Julilly nodded. Then, for the first time since leaving the Henson plantation, she began to cry. Fat Sims couldn't watch her here. The others in the cabin didn't care. Liza sat quietly. Julilly's sobs were the only sound in the dark room. The hunchbacked girl drew closer to her and waited. It seemed a long time before Julilly wiped her eyes and was still. "This is a no-good place," Liza muttered. Julilly agreed. "You been here a long time?" she asked. It was good talking to someone. In the jogging wagon, she mainly sang to the little children. Fat Sims didn't mind this, but he had scowled when she tried talking with Lester or Adam. Liza looked at Julilly closely before she answered. "I came at cotton pickin' time last summer," she said, "sold and bought and throwed in here to live like a pig." Her words were low and soft. Julilly had to strain forward to hear. Julilly wanted to ask more questions, but she held back. She wasn't sure she wanted to know the answers. "You been looking at my bent-up back and beat-up legs," Liza said bluntly. She seemed to read Julilly's mind. "Old Sims likes to whip me," she went on. She looked weary and rested her head on her drawn-up knees. "I tried running away. I got caught. Old Sims whipped me until I thought I was gonna die." Julilly felt a coldness creeping over her. It squeezed her throat and made her breathing come in jumps. "The slaves at Massa Henson's place feared it here in Mississippi," she answered her new friend. Liza suddenly relaxed. "You know what my daddy said to me once? He was a preacher where we used to live. He said, 'Liza, the soul is all black or white, pending on the man's life and not on his skin.' I figures old Sims got a soul like a rotten turnip." Both girls smiled. A bell rang, startling the listless girls in the cabin to action. They began wandering out of the door. Julilly and Liza followed. The bright sun was blinding after the shadows of the cabin. Julilly squinted her eyes and then opened them wide. She wondered if she was really seeing the sight before her. Little children, naked and glistening in the sun, were running toward a wooden trough in the yard. A man poured cornmeal mush into the trough from a dirty pail. The children pushed and shoved on hands and knees, sucking and dipping in the yellow grain until there was nothing left. Julilly stared with disbelief. She began looking for little Willie and the other children who had traveled with her in the wagon. But they weren't there. They hadn't yet learned how to suck their food from a trough like pigs. But Julilly knew that they would soon, or they wouldn't eat. She felt sick. Now she understood why the slaves in Virginia dreaded this place called the Deep South. Liza was right. This plantation was a no-good, rotten place to live. Liza yanked Julilly into the line of older boys and girls. They gathered around a black washpot where collard greens bubbled and steamed, and bits of fat pork pushed to the surface now and then. Each person carried a gourd and dipped it in. Julilly shared Liza's until an old woman came along and handed her one. There wasn't much talk. There was too much hunger. Julilly's gourd was empty, and there was nothing more to fill her aching stomach but a dipper full of water. There was no gaiety or bounce in the walk of anyone around Massa Riley's slave yard, Julilly noticed. At Massa Henson's, on a day off from work, folks collected in little groups to laugh and sing. Here it was like ghosts being pushed around. The slaves were as thin and frail as shadows. Again Liza yanked Julilly by the arm. This time she pulled her back to the cabin to take off her ragged tow shirt and put on a Crocker sack full of holes. "What's this for?" protested Julilly. "On Sunday, we wash any old rags that we wear for the rest of the week." Liza became sullen again. She could have been taken for a bent old woman if one forgot to look at the smooth, black skin of her face and her young, hurt eyes. The girls dropped their dirty clothes into one of the washtubs in the slave yard and punched them up and down in the steaming water. "Here's your batlin stick," Liza said, handing Julilly a hard, solid stick. "Now we just put our shirts on this big old block of wood and hit and battle the dirt right out of them." At last the miserable, beaten rags were hung on a rattan vine to dry. That night Julilly crept into the long, shabby cabin that housed the slave girls who had no parents. She lay down beside Liza, who shared her heap of rags. There was no talking. Everyone slept. Julilly looked into the dark. She was fearful of the morning when Sims would be back. Liza said the cotton in some of the fields was ready to be picked. She thought about the little children, about Adam, Ben, and Lester, and she wondered where Mammy Sally was sleeping tonight. "Lord, help us find each other again," she prayed and went to sleep. It seemed only a few minutes later to Julilly when a piercing bell clanged through the darkness. Liza pulled her up by her arm and led her out of doors, where a fire was crackling below the black-leafed trees. A line of slaves passed before it. Julilly followed. Each one was given a corn cake and a gourd of water for breakfast. Silently the line continued. This time hands reached out for a pail. Looking inside hers, Julilly saw that it held another corn cake and a cold strip of bacon. "It's your lunch," Liza whispered. "Don't eat it now." The line went on, women, men, and children all mixed up together. Next they all got Crocker sacks, low and baggy, to fasten around their necks. Julilly knew that before that day was done, she'd fill more than one bag full of white cotton bolls. Julilly had been picking cotton for 3 years now. The overseer at Massa Henson's always said how good she was, not breaking the branches off the stalks when she pulled off the blossoms. She could use both hands to snatch at the bolls and put them in the swinging sack around her neck without dropping one upon the ground. The line of slaves seemed endless to Julilly as they strung along the field behind Fat Sims. He swayed back and forth on his horse, flipping a cat-o'-nine-tails whip into the pink sky. Soon the sun would rise and burn up all the pink and coolness of the dawn. Julilly followed Liza. She saw that the girl limped and that she bent forward, as though her back was trying to push away the burden of her Crocker sack. "Too many whippins," a slave woman behind Julilly said, pointing toward Liza. The sun still hadn't risen far when the picking started. A sharp cry at the far end of the cotton row froze Julilly's hands in midair. Fat Sims had dismounted his horse and was flaying his whip over the back of an old, white-haired man. "He likes to beat at old folks and cripples like me," Liza said in a low voice without lifting her head. Julilly saw that Liza couldn't reach the high branches with her bent back, so she began pulling the open bolls from the top branches, letting Liza take all those at the bottom. Her new friend gave her a grateful smile. The sun rose, white and hot, burning at the nakedness of the ragged slaves. The face of Sims glistened with sweat. It dripped down from the wide brim of his hat. None of the slaves wore hats. There was no shade for their heads. Sim's anger rose with the sun. When the work slowed, he used his whip. Julilly's fear of the man turned to despair and then to intense dislike. She had never disliked anyone as much as this fat, squint-eyed Sims. She avoided looking at him. When he came near her, she worked steadily and tried to overshadow Liza, who crouched beneath her, pulling cotton from the lower branches. Once Liza said, after Sims had safely passed beyond them, that man thinks a slave is just like a workhorse. If you acts like a workhorse, you gets along just fine. If you don't, it's the cat o' nine tails on your back. The work went on picking, filling the crocker sack, emptying it into baskets, stamping it down. The small lunch and 15-minute rest seemed no longer than the time it took for a mosquito to bite. The slaves still picked when twilight came, and the red sun had slipped away to cool its fire under the earth. The long walk back to the slave quarters was silent, except for the shuffle of tired feet dragging through the dust. That night it was as dark as a snake hole in the long, low cabin where Julilly and Liza lay on their heap of rags on the hard dirt floor. There wasn't a wisp of wind, and the heat of the day stayed inside like a burning log. Julilly ached with tiredness, and hunger gnawed wildly at her stomach. There had been only turnips and a little side meat served for supper. The other slave girls along the floor slept heavily, but Liza was restless. Her hand reached out in the dark and touched Julilly. "You as a friend," the crippled girl whispered. "No one else ever picked the high cotton that my poor old back won't stretch to." Julilly felt a strong urge to protect this beaten, crippled girl who had once tried to run away. All alone Liza had run into the swamp, waded into the sticky water, and slept with no covering until Sims tracked her down. Julilly moved closer to her and began whispering to her about life at the Henson plantation and the sale to fat old Sims. Eventually she repeated her mother's words about Canada and the freedom that country held for every slave. To her surprise, Liza had heard about Canada too, and the two girls talked dreamily before drifting into sleep.